have a record of this, and we will post it on our website as we have all of the others. So give me 1 minute while I start recording. Great. Okay. The recorded webinar and slides will be posted on the Methodology Updates webpage in the next day or two. I'm Michelle Martin, Project Manager in Water Quality at DEQ, and I'll be supporting this webinar. Our team is pleased to present the 2022 Integrated Report Methodology Update that is currently in progress. In Webinar 1, we showed you a high-level overview of the proposed short-term updates for this report cycle and long-term updates for future report cycles. In Webinar 2, we covered dissolved oxygen delisting methodology and continuous pH listing and delisting. Materials from Webinar 1 and 2, including videos, are on our website. Today, we cover Watershed Assessment Units by Station and Aquatic Life Aluminum. Your input and questions are welcome. To participate, please use the chat function. You can click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Maybe you see it at the top of your screen. You can also raise your hand by opening the participants window and click on your name and virtually raise your hand, and we'll call on you. Please remember to keep your microphones on mute when you're not speaking to reduce background noise. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. The DEQ staff present today are Becky Anthony and James McConaughey from DEQ. We also have a ton of other people helping us today. Travis and Leslie from DEQ are helping us. Next slide. So here is the agenda. We're going to cover the two topics I mentioned, as well as provide an overview of the process. Remember, you have until November 24th of this month to submit informal comments to DEQ about the proposed assessment methodology updates. Becky will provide the information for submitting that feedback at the end of this webinar. And again, you can always go to our website for all of the information about what we're presenting today. Just to let you know, we are going to go through the slides, the presentations, prior to taking questions. So if you would like to put something in chat, you can do that. You can virtually raise your hand and we will get back to you. So Becky, let's get started.
All right, sorry. I have multiple screens, so I have a hard time sometimes getting my mouse to work.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay, next slide, Travis. Welcome, everybody. This is the third webinar, so the third and final webinar of our IR22 methodology updates. Just a quick reminder of where we are in the integrated report process. So we're in the development phase where we're developing a credible data policy and listing methodology for us to use for our integrated report 2022 assessment. We will be compiling all of the informal comments we receive on the methodologies that we've discussed, and we will be having a formal public comment period, which will likely begin in January. So then the next step will be our data solicitation phase, which we are anticipating a data call in February of 2021. And then we will assemble and evaluate all of the data we receive and assess the data and come up with a draft integrated report, hopefully by winter of 2021. So that is our timeline that we're looking at right now. Next slide. So just kind of to reiterate what we said, we've already had webinars 1 and 2. This is the third and final webinar for the 2022 methodology updates. We extended the deadline to receive informal comment and feedback on the methodologies until November 24th. So that's when comments are due. We are hoping to have the draft methodology with the comments incorporated out for a public comment period in early January of 2021. And we are going to be issuing our call for data in February of 2021. So anyone who is anticipating on submitting data to us for the 2022 report, that data call will be starting in February. And then, like I said earlier, we're hoping to have a draft 2022 integrated report out for public comment by December of 2021 in order for us to submit our final draft to EPA in April of 2022. Okay, next slide. So just a reminder of the updates that we are proposing for 2022. We have a delisting method for dissolved oxygen, a method for assessment of continuous pH. We also talked about how we're going to be delisting for freshwater coliforms using E. coli data. We've set minimum data requirements to assess something as category 2. And then the last two things that we're going to talk about today are our proposal to assess watershed units by station. And then we are going to be, EPA is promulgating a new aquatic life aluminum criteria. And James is going to be talking about that and how we plan on implementing that in the methodology. Okay, next slide. Next slide. All right, so bring us back to assessment units. So that's where I'm going to start. So I'm going to take you back a little bit in the history of the integrated report. So after the 2012 integrated report, DEQ undertook some major improvements to improve the process of the integrated report so that we could get on a 2-year schedule. And we had to meet new reporting requirements by EPA. And so one of those things that we did in our improvement process was to create what we call assessment units that are specific sections of water bodies that we assess every 2 years, and we can track the water quality in those water bodies over time. So in doing this, we had to set some goals for our delineation of these assessment units. And so our major goals that we had for creating these was we wanted to create consistency between reporting cycles, because previously segments changed every time we did the report. And so it was hard to track changes in water quality over time. So we wanted to remain consistent. The second thing was to align with the NHD, which is the National Hydrography Data Set, which is both the national and the state standard when it comes to mapping water bodies. The third goal was we wanted to create a manageable number of assessment units that we can assess every 2 years. There's a lot of water in Oregon, and so we had to come up with a way to create a manageable number of water bodies that we could assess. Fourth, and this was probably one of the big driving factors, is it had to align with EPA's attains reporting requirements. We are now required to report the integrated report into the attains system, which is EPA's system. And so our assessment units had to align with those requirements. And then the final goal of our assessment unit delineation was we wanted to base the units on hydrologically relevant breaks rather than human activity. Human activity can change over time, where these hydrologically relevant breaks are more something we can point to where it makes sense to segment a water body. And so those were the goals of our assessment unit delineation. And I want you to keep those in mind as I go through some of the issues that have arisen with the creation of these new assessment units. Okay, Travis. So just a refresher, the segments in 2012, we used a scale of 1 to 100,000, and it was the LLID system. And so if we got data for a water body that wasn't on this map, we had to self-digitize and create the water body on the map, which wasn't a really realistic way to do assessments. And so in moving to the new assessment units, we moved to the NHD, which is a 1 to 24,000 scale, and it maps all of the water bodies within Oregon. Okay, next slide. And so this is just an example of how it used to look. So the square on the left shows the Powder River listings in 2012. And each color represents a different parameter that was listed. And so you can see that there are multiple parameters that are listed for different portions. And it was hard to really keep track of the number of stream miles that were impaired, because you double counted, well, I wouldn't say double, it's in this case multiple counted, every single one of those listings. And so it was hard to come up with a statewide like survey of impaired waters. So moving forward in the Potter River, you can see we have 13 assessment units, and these are fixed. So they remain the same over time. We look at that same section of water body, and we'll be able to track the changes in that section over time. Next slide. So just a reminder, we have 5 types of assessment units. We have our rivers and stream units, which are the medium to large size streams. They're a trailer stream order of 5 or higher. We have the watershed units, which is what I'm talking about today. And these are small, typically headwater streams. They're trailer stream order 4th or lower, and they're grouped by the Huck 12 or at the sub-watershed level. Third, we have just water bodies, which are our lakes, our reservoirs, and our estuaries. We have our coastline or beach segments, and we also have our ocean segments, which are the Oregon territorial waters. Okay, next slide. So the watershed assessment units, like I said, they're typically streams that are trailer stream order 4th or lower. They're grouped at the sub-watershed or the Huck 12 level, which is the smallest Huck available in Oregon at this time. We define them using the NHD, which was a 1 to 24,000 hydrography data. All of the surface waters in Oregon are defined. So by including all some of those waters may contain canal or man.
Good. And so Becky,
yeah, I see. How is DEQ determining which breaks are hydrologically relevant? Leslie, do you have a good answer for that?
You lost you for the last like 30 seconds. Can you repeat everything you said and then go to the question?
Thank you, Marianne. That's exactly what I was thinking. So Becky,
sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, on the watershed assessment units? Should I just go through the whole slide again?
Yeah, why don't you just briefly do that?
Okay, watershed assessment units. They're typically trailer stream order 4th or lower, which are the smaller streams. They're grouped at the sub-watershed level, which is the Huck 12, which is the smallest Huck in Oregon currently. We define them using the NHD, which is a 1 to 24,000 scale, as opposed to a 1 to 100,000 scale. We defined, so all surface waters are defined in the assessment units. So by doing that, some of these watershed units may contain canals or managed water infrastructure. And so the question we had is, how is DEQ determining which breaks are hydrologically relevant? So I didn't want to get into it too much, but so when we set major rivers and streams units, we had a, I would say kind of like the hierarchy of how we broke those units. And the first break was where there was a standard instance in estuaries, there's no drinking water use. But then you hit the major river stream and the drinking water use becomes applicable. So that was where we made a break. So the second thing we broke on was on the Huck 10. And so we broke at a Huck, or was it is that the third, Leslie?
That was the third, yeah. No, the second was like a stream order change. Yeah. So meaning, you know, kind of a large tributary entering a river or stream.
Right, the large tributary. And the third was where we had Huck 10s and we would break there right. If none of the others occurred, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Just want to make sure I got that right. All right, next slide.
So we have one more question, Becky, but I'm thinking if you can answer it quickly, that's great. If not, let's keep going and get to the point where we've got a question and answer slide.
I just want to add one thing to your last answer, Becky.
Yeah.
Watershed units, their connection is just all water bodies within that Huck 12 boundary. That was a 1 through 4 stream order.
Okay, and so a lot of these questions in the chat right now are talking about irrigation infrastructure. And so basically what I was saying with regards to like canals and irrigation infrastructure is that they were mapped. So they appeared on the map, not necessarily that we have data and that we're assessing them, but when we switch to a 1 to 100,000 scale to the 1 to 24,000 scale, some of those irrigation infrastructure, which wasn't on the lower resolution, appeared on this map. And we can talk about that further as we go along. Okay, so this was just, we kind of did a deeper dive to look at the watershed assessment units, and we wanted to look at what types of watershed assessment units are there, because when we came up with the grouping at the sub-watershed level, we really anticipated that most of the watershed assessment units would look like these type 1 and type 2, where they're headwater streams, they're tributaries, and they grouped at the sub-watershed level, they connect to a larger major river and stream. And so in the type 2, sometimes the larger major river and stream runs through the watershed unit, but they are hydrologically connected. And so with this type of watershed unit, they make up about 55% of the watershed assessment units that we assessed. So this is over half of the watershed units that we assessed. Next slide. But then when we looked further, as you go lower down into the basin, we call these the type 3 watershed assessment units. And these are, this is kind of what we call our most controversial type, because there may be tributaries within the watershed, but they're not hydrologically connected. They're just connected by the grouping at the HUC 12 level. And so this was where we got most of our comments on the 2018-2020 draft. And these comprise about 1/3 of the watershed units that we assessed. Okay. So type 1 and 2 assessment units, they tend to predominantly be at the tops of the watershed, while these type 3 tend to be towards the middle and lower down. Action in 1 and 2 is really apparent.
Becky, let's pause.
This type.
Go back a little bit. Yep, you cut out again. And I just want to make sure people are getting this. It's really good information.
I'm sorry, do I keep cutting out?
Just a little bit. Again. We'll just wait just a minute, and I'm sure she'll come.
Becky, if you turn off your video, it may help your bandwidth improve.
Connection. Are you not
getting it? You cut out that whole time.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, guys.
If you turn off your video, it might help. It might help your connection improve.
Okay. Yeah, I shut off VPN, so I'm doing the best. Okay. All right. Can everybody hear me now?
We can.
Okay. All right. So the type 1 and the type 2 watershed units. So those are predominantly found at the tops of the watersheds. So that's our tributaries. That's what we anticipated when we developed these watershed units. So these type 3 watershed assessment units, they tend to be lower down in the watershed, towards the middle and lower, and their hydrologic connection is only through the HUC 12. So that is where the discrepancy arose in the 2018-2020 draft report. Okay, next slide. So that gets us to some of the comments we received. So one of the comments was, for these watershed units, there was a lack of detail in the listing. So they knew the watershed unit was impaired, but they didn't know, but you couldn't determine what stream was impaired within that watershed. So one of the things we tried to do in the final submittal to EPA is, in our assessment database, we included a column where the rationale for why the assessment unit was listed. And so it provides like a brief statement of why we were proposing that assessment unit as category 5. And we also made the data, for the first time, the data we used in the integrated report, available to download. And so it wasn't, you had to do a little bit of digging in order to see where the impairment existed. And so for 2022, in addition to this proposal for assessing by station, we're also working towards developing a more detailed listing rationale so you can see a lot of the supporting information we use to develop our listings. So the second comment was inclusion of irrigation infrastructure in our assessment. And so one of the things, like I said earlier, when we switched to the NHD, it was visible on the map. So they were included in the Watershed Assessment Unit. But when we identify a Watershed Assessment Unit as impaired, it means there's an impairment within that watershed and not that the whole watershed itself is impaired. And so in developing these units, there's no statewide GIS layer available for irrigation infrastructure. And by that not being available, and it also does not align with our stated goal, which I went through earlier, of aligning with the NHD. And so in the final report, what we tried to do was we represented the watershed units as polygons. And so the stream, we took out the stream network. So you saw that there was an impairment within that watershed, but not that the entire watershed was impaired. So the third one was the application of beneficial uses to all of these water bodies. And beneficial uses are designated in rule. And those are a function of the Water Quality Standards Program. And the assessment program is required to assess beneficial uses that have been designated. So we assessed uses that are currently exist. And so if there's some concern that a beneficial use may not exist on a particular water body, that is something that the standards program would review, and it would be something maybe to discuss at a triennial review for upcoming standards. And so the fourth thing was just a single assessment conclusion for multiple water bodies. And this kind of got back to the lack of detail in the listing. And so there was one conclusion, and you may have had data from multiple water bodies. However, it goes back to our stated goals. So one of our goals was we had to align with EPA's reporting requirements. And in order for us to align with those requirements, we had to have a single assessment conclusion for an assessment unit. And so, and I'll test that represents the watershed.
Becky, you cut out again. Let's back it up just a little bit.
Okay. So just so everyone knows, my VPN is off. My video is off. So where did I cut out?
You cut out just a minute or two ago. So I think that yeah.
Okay, so the single assessment conclusion. So we also wanted to adhere to our goal of creating a manageable number of assessment units. Oregon has over 2 million water bodies if you separate them by reach. And that is just not a manageable number of water bodies to assess every 2 years. And so we had to group water bodies in some way. And this was a standard method that's employed by other states. And so that was the method that we chose. Our visualization, so our representation of that impairment, and I kind of talked about that earlier where I said, we revised our map display. And so you don't see the stream network within the watershed, but the watershed is represented as a polygon and it's shaded. And so that is more to identify that there's an impairment exists within that watershed, but not necessarily that the entire watershed's impaired. Okay, next slide. So that led us to explore some options of what can we possibly do to make this better? If we did this at the reach code level, we would have over 2 million water bodies, and that's just not a viable option for defining assessment units with the amount of resources that we have and how we would assess. We had to group them into a smaller, manageable number of units, and it is a common method that's used by other states in order to do this. We looked at defining the watershed units at the first through third order streams, as opposed to first through fourth. And this only lowered the number of watershed assessment units by about 150. And so the amount of work it would take to do that was significant. And we didn't think, for as little difference as it made, that it did not make sense to do this option. We looked at splitting by land use, but that doesn't adhere to our goals of creating these fixed units that won't change over time. Land use changes over time, and so it would not maintain consistency between these reports. The same is also true. We could split units.
Becky, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think you cut out again.
Would it make sense for, like, does it make sense that I keep going, or would it be better if someone else?
Well, you know what, let's try to keep going. We have a question that we're going to pause on that question. We'll get to that. It'd be great to get through the slides. So why don't you try to keep going? I think that I'm going to interrupt you when you don't have sound, and we'll just have to back it up from there. So.
Okay. So I'm at splitting units by water quality standards?
Yeah.
Okay, so we looked at splitting our assessment units by a change in water quality standards. But as you all are probably aware, our water quality standards are pretty complex, and it adds a layer of complexity to an already complex system, and it's not relevant for all parameters. Standards are also subject to change as updates are made, and so this would not remain consistent. And it didn't align with our goal of having hydrologically based assessment unit breaks. So we also looked at whether or not it was possible to separate natural streams from man-made infrastructure. And like I said earlier, there is not a statewide GIS coverage for irrigation infrastructure. So it made this option infeasible at this time. It also does not align with our stated goal of aligning with the NHD, and maintaining this layer would be separate from an NHD update. And so it would make DEQ responsible for updating the layer with every NHD update. So it makes an already something that's complex even more complex. And so the final thing, which is what we decided on was our most viable option, was to assess watershed units by monitoring station. And so that is what I'm gonna hopefully try and talk about, that you guys can all hear me as we continue. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that brings us to our recommendation. We are recommending that we assess each watershed unit at the monitoring station level. We would identify the and then assessment unit conclusion.
So Becky, let's pause right there. I think what we're going to do, Travis, are you prepared to present? And I think we'll do a little back and forth here, a little, you know, at the ad hoc last minute. We're gonna switch on you, and we're gonna have Travis Pritchard. He's prepared and ready. And Becky, we're gonna pause on you for just a minute. See if we can catch up on audio. I think this is really important.
Becky, we got your internet connection catch up. So just what our current recommendation is we want to, instead of pooling all of the data within the watershed assessment unit, we want to assess the watershed unit at a monitoring station level. So all of the data for each monitoring station would be pulled together, but not more than one monitoring station pulled together. We would then be able to identify an impairment or attaining a conclusion at each monitoring station, and then we'll roll up those individual stations into a overall assessment unit conclusion. So what that would look like, kind of from a process view, is we would, for each parameter, we'd assess any station. If any one station got a category 4 or 5 listing, which is an impairment, that assessment unit would be assigned a category 4 or 5 condition. If at least one station, if none are impaired, if at least one station is a category 2, so that's at least one is category 2 and all the rest are category 3 or insufficient data, that assessment unit would be assigned a category 2 attaining condition. And then all the rest of it is kind of the various flavors of insufficient data. This process flowchart is exactly the same process as we use to roll up an overall assessment conclusion within parameters for an assessment unit. So if we had, for example, one parameter as a category 5 impaired condition, then that assessment unit would be color coded on our map as impaired. So what that would enable us to do is, if we were assessing on a per monitoring location and then roll that up from our visualizations, we would be able to indicate that where we found those impairments specifically and where we found attaining conditions. So in this example, these little triangles represent the monitoring stations that we assessed. These red ones, the 2 red triangles, those are assessed down to an impaired condition. And so then that would be labeled as impaired. This, it's important to note, this follows the same methodology that the TMDL group uses in their status and trends reporting. I'm going to throw it back over to Becky to see if it's if it's caught up. Yeah.
Yeah. Or I don't know. Do you want? You can keep going, or I can keep going.
Sure, I can keep going. Okay. I can keep going for these last 2 slides. As we did an evaluation of what were the impacts of this change being, where instead of pooling by assessment unit, we pool by monitoring location. One kind of factor that we should consider is that we may also be decreasing sample sizing for making an assessment conclusion. So for example, here's a assessment unit, this kind of watershed unit is bounded by this yellow line here. This is a assessment unit that we have 37 monitoring locations for. And when we looked at toxic monitoring within this watershed unit, only one of those stations meets minimum sample size requirements for assessment. And so if we took all of this data together, pooled it all, put it in one big pile and assessed it, we would meet minimum data requirements. But looking at it on a station by station, we would have a lot of monitoring locations that did not meet those minimum data requirements and would assess down to a category 3 or insufficient data. So primarily we're looking
Can I add a little bit, Travis?
Absolutely.
And so when we did this, we determined that the impact primarily would not be on conventional parameters, because folks who are sampling conventional parameters like DO, pH, or bacteria, typically they're fairly easy samples to get on the grand scheme of monitoring, and toxics monitoring can be very expensive. And so usually it's very targeted and a lot. And so you don't have as many toxic samples as you might a conventional parameter. And so we don't expect conventional parameters to be impacted in the number of minimum sample size. It would just be for those assessment units where we assess toxics. And when Travis did the analysis, it looks like if we looked at the amount of data for toxics that we had in the 2018-2020 report, if we broke that down into a 5-year period of record, it looks like it would affect approximately 10 to 15% of the watershed units where we assess toxics. So it's not a large impact, but it's not insignificant either. And so we wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of that as well. Did you catch all that?
We did, Becky. Thank you so much. Travis, you're back on, just in case. Last slide before questions and discussion.
Okay, Travis, do you want to do it or you want me to?
It sounds like you're working again, so I'll give it back to you, Becky.
Okay. So just to kind of summarize, the outcomes from this methodology change. So on the one hand, we would not be pooling data from waters that are not hydrologically connected. We would be coming up with assessment conclusions at the station level. There would be a greater specificity in our assessment conclusions because you'd be able to determine which stream or at what station the impairment exists. And it would be easier by looking at the map to identify at what station and water body that impairment occurs. So on the other hand, however, by making this change, it's also going to be harder to reach minimum data requirements when we're looking at toxics. So for toxics assessments, it is more likely that we're category 3s. And so, oh yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you're breaking up again. I'll jump back in with the other hand. So it is harder to meet those minimum data requirements for certain parameters, namely toxics monitoring, as well as that data will still get rolled up into an assessment unit level. So we'll still take assessment conclusions for a given monitoring location and kind of code that polygon as purple or green on the map, depending on how those monitoring units shake out. So I think at this point is where we wanted to open it up for discussion. Some kind of discussion points that we had generated are, what are, the participants in this meeting's thoughts on kind of that level of grouping by monitoring station as opposed to grouping by assessment unit. Are there anything that we haven't thought about, any sort of analyses that would be helpful as we make this determination? And we specifically want to hear from groups who are doing monitoring and seeing what kind of impact this would make on their monitoring program and if anything would need to change in that monitoring program.
And so let's go back to Megan's question. Does changing the visualization from all water bodies in the unit to a polygon for the unit change the interpretation that all water bodies within said unit will be considered listed as impaired? For example, when filling out grant applications, permit applications, etc.
Yeah, so currently our the way that we think about these watershed units being impaired is that when we have data within the assessment unit that indicates impairment, that's when we will label that assessment unit as impaired. What we're not saying is that all water bodies within that assessment unit are impaired. And so that was primarily the driver behind changing our visualization from the stream network, where we saw, in our draft report, I don't know if some of you saw, there was a bunch of red lines everywhere. And that was kind of being interpreted not how we are interpreting that ourselves. And so what we're saying is data indicates that there are impairments within that watershed, but not necessarily all the watershed all the waters within that watershed are impaired.
So great. Let's get through some of these questions. Becky?
Oh yeah, so hold on.
I'm going to read it. Do you know how much of the irrigation infrastructure is documented on GIS? Are you missing 20%, 30%?
I don't know for sure how much is documented, but if I had to make a guess, I would say it was the other way around, that we would likely probably have less than 50% documented on GIS Leslie, would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And it's my understanding that that's kind of done on a district by district basis. And, yeah, we only heard from 2 specific irrigation districts that they had theirs mapped out. So, I don't think we have really any idea.
Did you happen, this is Les Perkins, I manage Farmers Irrigation District. Did you happen to actually ask irrigation districts? Because I can tell you right now that the vast majority of districts have their infrastructure mapped on GIS. So it'd just simply be a matter of asking for that data layer, which I don't think is that big of a lift.
No, we did not ask specifically, but one thing I just kind of want to reiterate is that even if we separated out the irrigation infrastructure, like where their natural, where canals are in the places of natural streams, we're still required to assess them if we have data, because the beneficial uses have been designated to all water bodies across Oregon. And so we may be able to carve them out on a map, but we would still be required to assess them.
Becky, this is Mary Ann Cooper. How, to that question, how do you know that all of that infrastructure carries a beneficial use? Because I think we assumed in the last comments that it was, I think to us that seems like a big assumption.
Becky,
I don't know where, because,
okay.
Yeah.
So the way that waters in Oregon have their beneficial uses designated is through rule. And when those uses were designated, they were applied on a basin-wide scale with very little specificity to it. And so we, because they're in rule and we don't have kind of the ability to easily change that, we have to apply the beneficial uses kind of as they are stated in a rule, which is on a basin-wide scale.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, Travis, I know
that is such a bummer, Becky.
no, if you want to remove one of those uses, it is a standard and remove a use. And
you're
can you not hear me again?
Yeah,
okay.
You went on for just a second, but great.
My internet today, I don't know what's wrong.
It happens.
Yeah, but it's a standards process, and it's a significant process to remove a use. And so you would have to talk to the standards folks about what the requirement is, because you also have to look at not just the use on that water body itself, but the downstream use. And so, yeah.
Okay. Can we take another question, comment from Mary Ann? When you say pool at the monitoring station, do you mean pooling data taken at the same station in different times of the year, or what does that mean?
Yeah, so the way the 2018-2020 assessment was carried out is we took all of the data that we could find within an assessment unit, kind of put it on a big bucket, and then ran through the assessment methodology using that data. What this new change would be is just, instead of grouping it by assessment unit, we would group it by monitoring station. So we would only be assessing, we would assess, say for temperature, we would look at all of the data we have in the 5-year data window for monitoring station A, run that data through the assessment methodology, come up with an assessment conclusion, do the same for assessment unit B, and then take those 2 different conclusions and roll them into the assessment unit conclusion. Whether or not we take them at different times of year is methodology dependent. So for example, temperature during spawning periods is when we segregate out data from certain times of the year.
So let's go to, we have Nina, and then we have Les, and then Nina again, but I just want to make sure that I'm understanding. So Nina, you said, could you elaborate on the requirements of EPA's attains reporting system, since it seems to be driving a lot of the decisions? And Les said, yes, but that's not how other agencies and entities are interpreting this. I don't know if those were connected, but they seem like they are. And then there's another comment from Nina. So Becky, if you could take those 2, or maybe.
Yeah. Leslie, can you take the attains, like how
I can, sure.
meeting EPA's reporting requirements, and I'll take the second part.
Sure. So ATTAINS is EPA's new reporting database. All the states are required to submit their integrated report via the ATTAINS system, and that requires that assessment units be fixed over time. So we couldn't go back to the approach that we used last time where we delineated based on stations each cycle. ATTAINS just won't accept that approach. So that was, I think, kind of what Becky was alluding to at the beginning. And then they also wanted it tied to the NHD if possible, or some referenced geospatial data set. It had to be mappable. So hopefully that answers the question. Yeah.
And so I can take the second part if we're still making impairment.
Becky, this is less. I actually, so my comment was more, it wasn't related to the previous. It was actually, I was commenting on the statement that was made that while the watershed, well, the water bodies are listed as impaired, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the individual water bodies within that watershed are impaired. My statement was that that's not how other entities are interpreting that.
Oh, I mean that we've been pretty I don't what's the word? I mean, we've been pretty clear that that's how we interpret it, and you know, if other agencies are interpreting in a different way, we'd be happy to discuss with them how our interpretation of what this means. But we've been pretty clear that this is how we interpret impairment within the watersheds.
Okay, but just so you know, when you're going through permitting and you're applying for funding, and this comes up as a snag, it actually can end up costing you time on a permit that can delay a project. It can also cost you a funding source because you have to clarify, or it's not clear as they go through your application.
Right, and that's one of the advantages of assessing by monitoring location basis is we would have much more clear, the permit writers and any other person who's interacting with this data set would have much more clear, much more specificity of which water bodies specifically are driving that impairment conclusion or not.
Yeah, you'd be able to see what they were impaired for and where the impairment exists by implementing this new method.
Should we take some hand raising before we get back to the chat?
Can I get to this last chat question?
Yeah.
Or which one?
Why don't you go ahead and do that, and then we'll take the hands.
Okay, well, I'll take, so if you're making impairment decisions at the monitoring station level, how are you meeting the goal of making it more manageable? Travis, do you want to talk about, because this is related to how you develop the code. So originally the code was developed to pool all of the data within the watershed itself, but we would just be separating it out so that it would be pooling at the monitoring station level.
Yeah, it's a manageable process to assess on a monitoring location basis, and then roll that up into an assessment unit. That is easy. Well, not easy, but the I think specificity trade-offs are worth the extra effort that we would go through in the assessment process. Where we really are talking about assessment units, trying to make a manageable process with assessment units is if we were to divide up Oregon's waters into, say, reach codes, which is a much smaller water body dividing system, we would end up with over 2 million different assessment units in the state. And so that is a kind of an unmanageable process for us given our resources. And so, and then one other point is we would still be reporting on an assessment unit basis to EPA through ATTAINS. And so that reporting process wouldn't change for us.
So let's take the hands, and I think this is Linda. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, and then we'll go to Katie.
Hi, I'm not Linda, I'm Dale. I'm using her computer because mine's not working right now. I'm Dale Feek.
Hi, Dale.
I'm glad you answered Nina Bell's 2 questions. I hope it was clear to the answers. I'm sure she will pursue it. My question has to do with Tualatin River watershed. And I'd like to know whether this system will be applied to that, and specifically, will it be applied to the temperature toxic, and will it be applied based upon the spawning season of the fish in the Tualatin River and the tributaries? So that's, and the amount of monitoring stations you'll have in the Tualatin River.
Yeah, I mean, nothing will, I mean, what will change is just how we group the data. And so I'm not, you know, I don't have the spawning seasons and what data we have kind of readily available for the Tualatin, but we would be, instead of taking, you know, let's say there's 3 monitoring locations in the same assessment unit, instead of putting all that into one bucket, we would just be assessing those 3 separately. I don't know if that's answering your question. All this changes basically at what level are we grouping our data buckets, our assessment data buckets.
And if this is Leslie, if I could just elaborate that on a little bit. So we're still assessing at individual stations according to their assigned spawning uses that are in rule. What we're talking about is the difference between when we get to the point of tallying exceedances at a particular assessment unit level. So this is more a way of grouping in the 2018-2020 for a watershed assessment unit. We brought all the kind of tallies of exceedances together and made a determination based on that. What we're proposing now is to tally exceedances using the binomial based on the station. So it's kind of getting into the weeds, but what has been designated in rule as a spawning temperature remains in both methods that we were exploring.
And then one other point is this change would only apply to data within those watershed type units. And so rivers and streams, we would still, since they are kind of a more linear, more definitely connected type of water body, we would still be pooling those on an assessment unit basis.
The reason I asked the question, I'm Dale Feek again, is because there's the major temperature problem on the Tualatin River based upon Hag Lake and trying to get more water and getting ways to use some of that water to decrease the temperature. So it's a real concern of mine in the Tualatin River water basin, especially since they're doing not point source as much as they're doing watershed management. So I don't have the details of all that, but I'm just expressing that concern.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to remind folks that we do have aluminum coming up. So I'll take the final 2 hands, Katie and then Marianne. If you could keep your comments to, you know, a minute as a question. And then I want to remind people too, November 24th, we will take those informal comments on what we've presented. So we do look forward to getting those from all of you. And Becky will tell you at the end how to do that. In short, you can go to our website and submit an email via the website. And it's all the information is on there. So let's go to Katie.
All right, thanks. And thanks for trying to put all this together. I know it's really hard to make it make sense for all of the streams in the state. You're doing a great job. So I just wanted to clarify, because I think a lot of people have the same question, and this is sort of the crux of what everyone's worried about. So if, for example, we have a watershed unit where we have one very large tributary where we have a lot of data and it's an impaired water body for several parameters because we have ag and urban use, and it's listed as impaired. And then that's in the same watershed unit as a bunch of tiny tributaries where we have 0 data and they're coming off of forested headwater streams. So I think previously those were all considered listed as impaired. With this new assessment, are those considered data deficient, or are they listed as impaired?
So they'll be listed, they'll still be listed as impaired. They'll still be kind of covered within that purple polygon area that we have in our draft and in our 2018-2020. What will be different is, well, I mean, not different, but you know, our permit writers, let's say you're trying to get a permit for one of those data deficient headwater streams that you're talking about. What the permit writers will do is they'll go looking and seeing where is that impairment coming from. And so they'll see that that impairment is not hydrologically connected at all to kind of where they're trying to write a permit for, and they'll take that into an account. what this will do is they'll just make their job a little bit easier and make it clear, because right on a map, we'll have like, all right, this stream right here, this is where the data comes showing impairment. We're not saying everything is impaired. We're saying that this isn't, this one stream where we have data for is impaired. Does that make sense, Katie?
Yeah. Yes, perfect. Thanks for the clarification.
Okay, and then we had Marianne.
Hi, yeah, and I would echo, thank you guys for this opportunity. I think this is a significant improvement in terms of kind of the ground truthing of the data and making sure that we're not casting kind of an overly broad net. I guess I would just really encourage the department to continue to think about, I think to Les's point, it's maybe easier than you think to pull out some of the man-made infrastructure. And I think continuing to include that as mapped and as impaired when, you have almost zero data there. And a lot of those times they're fish screened off and not connected hydrologically back to the main water body units. And so that's where I question whether the water quality standards should even apply to them. But I think we still need to continue to work on the man-made infrastructure challenges. But I do think that this method of presentation will hopefully help alleviate some of the confusion that people have had, thinking that you guys have, for example, data for every stream that's listed in an assessment unit when you don't. So we'll do comments by the 24th in more detail as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And I just would like to point out that at least as far as irrigation infrastructure goes, it's not quite as clean cut as, this is irrigation structure and this isn't irrigation, or like this is irrigation structure and this is kind of a natural stream, when there's a lot of kind of commingling between those two. And so I think that's really the challenge that we don't really have the resources for is to untangle that commingling and what is a infrastructure that should be segregated into its own, say, assessment unit, and what is kind of a natural water body that is conveying irrigation water, where there's not always a bright line between those two.
Yeah, and I would just add that for those who would like to pursue removing a use, then they should talk to folks in the standards unit, because there are cases like where irrigation water is piped, and that is the opportunity to go to standards and talk about removing uses. And that would be a way to address the issue.
Yeah, and I guess I just say, Becky, I mean, this is the first time I've learned that DEQ, thought the uses were attached to those water bodies. So yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, but I don't think it was necessarily something that's commonly understood or known. And I think y'all's process maybe brought it to light. So
yeah, I would encourage you, for folks who would like to remove a use, to talk to folks in our standards unit. And we can send out an email following this webinar with contacts for those folks interested in doing that.
And so I'd like to, I see that there are other comments, but we do need to move forward. You can contact our team, Travis, Becky, Leslie. You can get through on our website. Becky's email address is on there. This is a very public process. So feel free to contact with questions and comments. And again, November 24th, we're taking those informal comments, meaning this is not the formal comment period that we'll have later in the process. So we look forward to hear from you. But let's move on. James, are you ready?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. So we've taken in some of your time, about 15 minutes of your time. So good luck.
Yeah, you got to talk fast.
That's not usually a problem. Michelle, if you need to interrupt me, why don't you go ahead if there's a time issue during my section, feel free. Just let me know. So I'm James McConaughey. I'm a standards specialist with the Water Quality Standards Program at DEQ. I've been involved with standards development for some of our toxic metals criteria, including what used to be the new copper biotic ligand model criteria. And I've been working pretty closely on the promulgation of the new national aluminum criteria for Oregon. So I'm going to talk to you today about a little update about the status of those new criteria for Oregon and DEQ's proposed path forward for implementing and conducting assessments with those criteria. Next slide. So let me get my slide up too. There's been kind of a long path leading towards the impending promulgation of the federal criteria that are due at the end of this year. So I'd just like to kind of quickly go through where we came from in the aluminum and where we're kind of ending up. So the whole saga kind of started back in 2004, and that was when Oregon submitted a suite of revised aquatic life criteria for a number of different pollutants, including aluminum, which at the time was based on the current 1988 national criteria for aluminum. In 2013, EPA issued a final disapproval of a number of the hi Connie, a number of the state's criteria submissions. And then 2015, EPA was sued for failing to promptly propose and publish replacement criteria for some of those disapprovals, and that was including aluminum amongst others. In 2016, that lawsuit worked through to a federal consent decree where EPA was required to approve or promulgate criteria by March 27th of this year. And that was administratively, well, there was an agreement and it was extended to December 31st, which is our new current deadline. Next slide. So in 2013, at the time of disapproval, DEQ elected not to adopt new state aluminum criteria. And the reasoning for that was there really wasn't an alternative criterion available. The 1988 guidelines were still the national criteria, which had been disapproved. So the state didn't feel it had the resources to take on developing an entirely new criteria at the time. And also recognize that any new criteria would be going through ESA consultation for the first time. And we determined that it would be, just from the state's perspective, more efficient to have EPA propose criteria and seek that consultation before the state sought to develop its own criteria. The EPA did submit a draft rule for Oregon, which was signed on April 18th of 2019 last year. And as I said, they're on track for final rule publication by December 31st of 2020. EPA did go through the National Marine Fisheries Service consultation, and in June 30th, NMFS found that, that the new criteria were not likely to jeopardize T&E species, threatened and endangered species in Oregon. So that, that hurdle was cleared in June. Next slide, please. So a little bit about what these new national criteria are. They're published by EPA in December of 2018. They replaced that old 1988 criteria, which was a fixed criterion of 750 micrograms per liter acute aluminum and 87 micrograms per liter chronic as a total recoverable criterion. The new criteria are a site-specific instantaneous water quality criteria based on water chemistry. So similar to the copper biotic ligand model, if you're familiar with that. Also, like copper, it's a calculator-based, which is actually pretty similar to the hardness-based metals and ammonia criteria that we already have on the books in Oregon. It takes water chemistry input for dissolved organic carbon, hardness, and pH, and uses that to calculate an instantaneous criteria. Next slide, please. So as I said, these are site-specific and instantaneous, which means they apply to the water chemistry that was present in stream when the aluminum sample was collected. They're expressed as total recoverable, and we calculate those criteria. EPA has provided both an Excel spreadsheet calculator and an R package for calculating these criteria. There's a wide range of possible values that depend on water chemistry as it changes aluminum toxicity. And in some cases, the instantaneous criteria are less stringent than the 88 criteria. And they also tend to be more stringent in places that are sensitive because of low DOC, pH is outside the range of 6 to 8, and usually areas of low hardness. So we're expecting that these criteria will be more stringent in upper parts of the Coast Range or the West Slope Cascade, which receive a lot of rainfall, or more arid portions of Eastern Oregon because of the effects of pH on those water bodies. And those are places where the water chemistry is going to tend to make the aluminum more bioavailable and therefore more toxic to aquatic life. And so the criteria have to come down. So the status of that promulgation for Oregon, so EPA is adopting that national, the new national criteria by reference for Oregon. So it'll be that the criteria values calculated by that spreadsheet calculator or our code. For characterizing ambient waters, Oregon may utilize a scientifically appropriate method to measure bioavailable aluminum as opposed to total recoverable, except where prohibited by state and federal regulations. I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. But just a reminder is right now, 40 CFR Part 136 specifies that permit limits are established in using total recoverable methods. So those are usually point source permits and 401 certifications where those are spelled out exactly. But DEQ intends to apply a bioavailable aluminum measurement for assessment and RPA when that's available. And there's language in the national criteria and in some of the technical support documents that are being drafted by EPA right now that support this bioavailable method. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about that. I think we went one down. No, wrong way. There we go. So I'd like to talk a little bit about this bioavailable aluminum and how it differs from total recoverable and dissolved, because it's likely to be important as we're implementing this criteria for Oregon. The key issue has to do with the way the toxicity studies were conducted and some of aluminum specific biogeochemistry. That total recoverable aluminum in the field, especially where there's a lot of suspended solids, may overestimate the toxicity. And because of the methods that were used in the laboratory that the new criteria is based on, the criteria generators evaluated for the calculator would be considered protective for both total recoverable field methods or bioavailable field methods measured in the field. Next slide, please. So a little bit of the chemistry background, because it's important for this distinction. There are three ways that we've kind of looked at measuring aluminum in water. And we're used to seeing dissolved and total recoverable for a lot of our metals, other metals criteria. So in the dissolved form, aluminum ion from things like dissolved salts, they don't have a solid form in the water. They're completely dissolved into the liquid. And this is similar to how most metals criteria usually think about toxicity. So we looked at usually the dissolved form is going to be the most bioactive and therefore toxic form in solution. Aluminum is a little bit unique in that it forms a lot of hydroxide complexes at higher, especially higher pH levels. So these will look like kind of cloudy, fluffy colloids suspended in the water. And those can still physically clog gills. And they're considered part of the toxic component, which is why EPA expressed the criteria as total recoverable instead of dissolved like a lot of the other metals. But since aluminum is ubiquitous in the environment, it's the most abundant metal and third most abundant element in the crust. It's a major component of soils and clays. So you can usually find aluminum just about anywhere out in the environment, which isn't necessarily the same for a lot of the metals, other metals that are more rare. And when we measure this total recoverable fraction from the field, it includes a lot of these inert sources of aluminum because of the way that the laboratories measure total recoverable aluminum. And this inert aluminum from soils and suspended solids and clay, it gets included in those total recoverable measurements back in the laboratory. So since we're really concerned about the toxic fraction of aluminum, which are the dissolved ions and these colloidal hydroxides, the bioavailable method is kind of a third measure that's should be intermediate between the dissolved and the total recoverable that we measure from our standard methods. And this should account for both the dissolved ion and the hydroxide precipitates that contribute to toxic effects without over accounting for this inert aluminum that's also present in the water column from solids. Next slide. So what that looks like, so to start, when they did these lab studies in for the national criteria, they used aluminum salts like aluminum chloride or aluminum sulfate, and those pretty much dissolve 100% in these test waters where they do the toxicity studies. So even though they measured those as total recoverable, they're pretty much measuring all of the salt they added as a dosage for that. So this is represented by this blue bar, this fraction of a blue bar, and these are those ions and precipitates that would be present in the lab water when you dissolve these salts. Advance the slide, please, one. But when we go to measure using the same total recoverable method, which is a pretty strong digestion down to pH 2, in natural waters in the environment, you also end up digesting the suspended particles, this clay, these aluminum oxides, small particles of metallic aluminum. So you end up really pulling in a larger world of aluminum sources than you would do in the lab study. And this is what leads us to a little bit of concern about sort of overestimating toxicity under certain conditions. Do you advance the slide, please? So what the bioavailable measurement would do when we measure natural waters, I won't get into the technical details too much, but it just, most methods that look at bioavailable aluminum are based on a less aggressive digestion that's a little closer to the natural pH ranges we would see in the field. It's slightly lower than those, but it's not as dramatic as down to a pH 2. And the idea from that is that you're still going to dissolve and be able to measure all of those ions and precipitates that are contributing to toxicity without kind of pulling all this other clay that's present in these inert soil particles into the sample. So that's the goal around these bioavailable methods and why we think it's pretty important for implementing that in Oregon. Next slide, please. So moving on to implementation, we currently don't have any 303D listings for aluminum in Oregon, and these would have been based on using the 88 criteria. Right now, there's an aluminum ecotoxicology research group has submitted a bioavailable method for evaluation as an ASTM standard method. That's pending, but that's what we've been really watching closely is for that to become available. And that consortium is led by Allison Cardwell and Bill Stubblefield at OSU. And in additional, there's some other members that are as consortium of European regulators and representatives from the aluminum industry. EPA is also looking at developing a bioavailable method as well. And these would both just be for measuring ambient waters, not effluents. Our DEQ lab has been looking at the research coming out of OSU and has been working on a bench protocol for measuring bioavailable aluminum. And we began collecting trial samples to develop this methodology in second quarter of 2020. So that's also in the works. So this is all pending, but Oregon is looking to be using this bioavailable field method to do the implementation of the criteria. All right, so with that, I'm going to talk about our proposed listing requirements or listing methods for the new criteria. And in general, it's going to follow the methods we use for the other aquatic life toxics, heavily relying on a statistical test for a 5% exceedance rate at 90% confidence using the binomial, an exact binomial method. And this is how we did all of our toxics in 2018 and 2020, all of our aquatic life toxics. So we continue that through. And for water bodies where bioavailable aluminum has been collected and we have enough data to make an assessment decision, we put those water bodies in category 5 that exceed that listing threshold for under the binomial. What we're proposing now, because we expect total recoverable is going to overestimate toxicity, for water bodies where we only have total recoverable data, which is going to be all of our legacy data up to the current date, where it's exceeding that threshold and we don't have other information, we put it in category 3B for the time being. And DEQ is pursuing development of a translator to be able to convert total recoverable data to an estimate of what the bioavailable fraction would be, looking at the influence of total suspended solids in those samples. So this is a way we could then recalculate these with an estimate of bioavailable data. And then for water bodies where we don't have, we have a mixture of bioavailable and total recoverable, but not enough bioavailable to make a listing decision. We would still continue to use that category 3B for samples that are over that criteria, over that listing condition, until more data is available, and prioritize collection. We really are prioritizing this collection of bioavailable aluminum data across the state at our monitoring sites. So that's a quick summary of where we are I should add, this is preliminary, and DEQ seeking comment and input on these listing methods right now. And Becky, feel free to add anything I'm missing on that.
Hey, James, this is Connie. I just want to emphasize that this is the EPA promulgated Oregon standard. We don't have the published EPA standard yet.
Yes, this is, yeah, this is all based on their draft, on the national criteria, the comments that EPA received on the national criteria, and the draft rule that they published back in last spring. Thanks, Connie. That's a good segue, because the next steps are, we're still waiting to see what the final criteria are going to be. And as I said, EPA has let us know that they're still on track for publishing this by December 31st. And in anticipation of that completion date, DEQ is working on implementation procedures, which would follow, how to handle data, how to run the model, how to evaluate samples where there might be data missing in order to run the calculator and get criteria. So we'd be following our model using the copper BLM approach, how we've been implementing that because it's a similar water chemistry-based criterion that's instantaneous. And our lab is working on measuring bioavailable aluminum right now in the field and collecting data to develop a translator so we can evaluate historic aluminum data in a bioavailable framework. And regardless of the status of those, when the criteria finalized for Oregon, they'll be immediately effective for Clean Water Act programs.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in there, James, because they will be immediately effective. And so we wanted to make sure when we did the assessment in 2021 that we were assessing the current and effective standards. So we didn't have a repeat of the assessment of toxics, which happened in 2012.
So James, great work doing that, truncating that entire presentation. I'm sure there are questions. We have just a couple of minutes for questions and then we'll close up. So do we have any comments or questions for James? And again, you are welcome to contact him at any time. We can put his contact information up.
Did you say in a can? Yeah, I probably did because I'm listening to this.
Okay, I'm not sure that was meant for us. So I went ahead and muted. Hopefully I did not offend anyone. Are there any comments or questions for James? Okay, not hearing any or seeing any. Am I missing anything, Becky or Travis?
I see one hand raised.
Oh, good. There you go. Okay. And that is not Linda. So go ahead.
Yeah, I am Dale. Would you put those Kaylee and James emails on the chat? Because I can't copy that, but I can copy a chat and paste it.
Absolutely. I'll do that right now. As we do that, because I'm not seeing any more questions, Becky, why don't you jump in? James, thank you so much. Again, great presentation. You made that really quickly, too quick because there's a lot of good information in there. Becky, why don't you do the next slides and I'll get some contact information out.
Okay. Next slide, Travis. All right, so just a reminder, I mentioned these at the beginning. These are the short-term updates where we are accepting informal comments on our methodology proposals, our delisting for dissolved oxygen, assessment of continuous pH, our delisting for freshwater fecal coliforms, our minimum data requirements for category 2, the aquatic life aluminum, and watershed units assessment by station. So we will be accepting informal comments on those. I think next slide, Travis. The feedback is due on November 24th. So be sure and have those comments to us. Michelle has provided the contact information. And so once again, we're gonna incorporate those informal comments and we will come out with a 2022 draft methodology for a formal public comment period in January of 2021. We will be having our call for data in February of 2021. So folks who want to submit data, have that on your calendar so you're ready to submit in February. And then we will hope to have a draft 2022 IR out by December of 2021 with final submittal to EPA in April of 2022. Okay, next slide. So the next steps, once again, informal comments due to us November 24th. This is our email integrated report at deq.state.or.us. If you have questions or that you
I think what Becky's meaning to say
want
is
to follow up with that we didn't answer, feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to leave our contact.
Oh, the technology.
Did I cut out again?
Well, you did, and then it speeds up. So again, anyone, we're going to post the video. We're going to post the presentation. I just put our website up. For standards, you can contact James or Kaylee. For everything else, Travis, Becky, and Leslie. Leslie works at our lab, and they're doing a really great job on this. So those are our last slides. We do have just 5 minutes. Are there any more questions or comments before we close? And let's make them brief.
Michelle, just reminding everybody the background paper is on the website too.
There is. And so everyone's getting those Gov delivery notifications from DEQ. You can sign up for those on the webpage, which I've put in the chat. That's one of the best ways. It's probably the best way to get information about everything that's going on with the integrated report and pretty much anything at DEQ. So if you're not getting those Gov delivery emails, please do sign up.
Can you copy that right there? Copy.
Oh, yeah. Can you copy that on the chat, Michelle?
Actually, copy from there up to there. Copy that.
Sure. So let's see. What you can also do is you can go to the website. It's on the right side of the page, and you can click on the link that connects you to the Gov delivery. And so, okay, I think we're good then.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing, Michelle?
Please do.
I just wanted to thank everybody for participating. We have had such excellent participation in our webinars, and we are so happy that people are following our updates and what we're doing. And we feel free to reach out to us if you have questions on any of these methodology updates. But thank you for taking part in these webinars.
Greatly appreciated and well said. Thanks everyone for helping put this webinar together. Everyone have a great day and be safe. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.